Chapter 4. R-Bar, Deck 15, Karma 1, Sector 6. Okay, let's get you out of here, the man called Rupert said. He fussed for a moment, trying to figure out how to push my chair and still hold onto the materials he was holding. I held out my hands. My arms still work, I told him. He gave them to me and quickly took control of the rackety chair and pushed me out. There was another explosion. The ship lurched as the gravity dampeners readjusted. "Oh, Lords," Rupert exclaimed from behind me. He stopped for a moment while the ship steadied itself and then continued pushing. The walk back to my quarters was tense. We kept having to pause to let crew move past us. No one ran. They just walked very briskly. Probably a safety protocol, I noted. Eventually, we arrived at my door. I couldn't see the door code, but Rupert told me to speak to the computer, and it granted me access after a few questions. A few moments later, he wheeled me in, sighing in relief. He was still flustered. He came in and took the things he'd handed me and then put them down on the desk. Then he helped me get settled, doing his best to reassure me that it didn't happen a lot. "But it does happen?" I asked. He shrugged. "From time to time, yeah." He scratched nervously at the back of his head. "I mean, with the League's flagship, we have the greatest range and speed of any ship in the fleet." "But I thought the League lived in peace." "We do." He hesitated. "The Drass? Not so much." "You're still at war with them?" He frowned. "Not really." He paused for a moment and then looked something up on his handheld. "Okay, I was just checking I wasn't going to tell you anything classified." He handed me his device with a bunch of text highlighted. Obviously, it was written in human standard language, but I'd learned enough in school and travels to decipher it. It says that while there is a temporary armistice that has been going on for the last 240 years, but still no peace treaty or accord with the Drass, no trade agreements. But that was something the League pushed for in the early days. Sounds very 21st century British, I noted. He looked confused. I continued reading. So it looks like this isn't as straightforward as doing a deal with one people. There are factions and bandits and all kinds of folks who aren't bound by any agreements. He nodded. They call them frontiers for a reason. Reminds me of the old Wild West back on Earth. The frontiers are the territories that bump up against known Drass areas, then? Exactly, he confirmed. I handed the device back to him. The ship seemed to have returned to normal. There hadn't been any crashes or lurches for several minutes. I listened for a moment. "So you think we're out of the woods?" Rupert pursed his lips and checked his device again. "Still on red alert, but I've been called to command. That's a good sign." "Why?" "Well, I'm kind of the communications officer. I mean, I have a supervisor I report to, a career league officer. But if there were any chance of an ongoing dialogue with any species, the Drass specifically, they'd have me there to translate and offer insights. But by the sounds of it, there was a kinetic exchange and we drove them off." I tried to look impressed. Humans like that, being impressive. Okay, I know, it's manipulative, but it's also the way of endearing people to you and making them feel happy in your presence. Social lubricant. It's always worth doing. Well, mostly. Anyway, he seemed encouraged and smiled. "Can I get you some tea?" he asked. "Yes, please." He strode over to the replicator and made us both cups before sitting down at the sofa and chattering away, explaining his position. "So my speciality is technically archaeology, anthropology, and astrology, but because of the range of knowledge, my hobby for languages became an asset back when I was serving on digs. Cultural research missions." He sipped his tea delicately. I tried to emulate him, but it was too hot. I held it, unable to reach the table in front of the sofa easily. He continued. I would make myself useful on these missions, and then someone on Karma 1 got wind of our missions, or scrapes rather, and requested my transfer. They gave me a couple of bumps in rank over the course of the next few years to give me security and command clearance, and well, that's how I ended up translating some of the most tense negotiations between groups in the Outer Territories. I was a little confused. Wow, so you didn't go through the academy? Oh yes, long before that. I signed up in order to, see the world, like most young cadets. I don't know what it's like on your world, but if you're born on Earth, you pretty much stay there your whole life unless you get out early. I frowned. You mean you literally can't leave if you get old? He chuckled. No, not at all. It's just, well, people get used to their life being a certain way. Plus, you have to join up for service by the age of 25 if you want in. After that, opportunities to leave are limited, reserved only for the brightest and best. And even then, if there are people already in the system who can do 80% of the job you can, they'll go with them. He waved his hands. It's just accepted. Logistics mostly. And to be fair, most people who stay on Earth do so because they don't want the uncertainty of being, a space nomad. Different lifestyle. I smiled. Space nomad. I like that. It's a good phrase for what we are, even though you have this ship. Yes, he agreed. So what about you? I didn't really know how to answer that. How do I communicate to him all the ways my world was different but the same? A voice tripped over Rupert's comm. Commander Anthony to command, please. He touched the device on his wrist. On my way, sir. He smiled at me. Duty calls. But he clocked the status change on his device. We're back to yellow alert, so the threat is indeed gone. Well, that was a relief. Thank you for bringing me back to my quarters, I told him. He popped his tea down and stood up. It was my pleasure. Good to meet you, Karma. You too, Commander. He shook his head. My bosses call me a commander. Please just call me Rupert. Rupert, I repeated, smiling. And with that, he gathered up his things from the table and whipped out of the room in a flurry of activity. I'm not sure if the man has ever truly experienced stillness. Well, maybe when he was deep in study, he might. I smiled to myself. It's funny, in the activity of the last several hours, I hadn't been all sadness. Maybe just, 70% sadness in the background. But that's not 100% sad. I thought about it some more. In those moments when the ship was under attack, I also felt less dead inside. Like the new me that was emerging from my last crash had more life force than the old me that I had left behind. Sure, there was a vegan philosophy who mentioned something about it's only in facing death that we truly find our life. I don't know. I don't recall the reference, and I doubt this mission-focused ship had that kind of cultural archive for me to look it up. Incidentally, you should know that the archive is the word the League folk use for their collective database. It holds everything from records from their history through to research papers and data. In fact, everything that you can imagine they might want to store is generally accessible by the entire population. Archive is pronounced archive, that's spelled with an X, and probably was derived directly from that word by some hotshot visionary who conceived of the method that would allow all of the intel to be distributed and accessible from anywhere on any of their ships or colonies. Anyway, first things first, I set about trying to figure out the wheelchair. I needed to be able to do things like tidy up the cups, and everything I'd done so far, I'd been able to put things in my lap and carry them. Cups with tea still in them? Well, that was a challenge. Plus, I needed the practice. There had to be a way for me to wheel myself. I just needed to figure it out.